All right, guys, I'm doing a top 10 video. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Theo. Thanks for hanging out. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and maybe go ahead and leave a like on the video because it helps quite a bit. I'm really excited about this one because I wanted to do a video on the top 10 standalone fantasy novels that I want to read and that I continue to come across when I'm looking for standalone fantasy novels to fit into my schedule. If you're anything like me, you read a ton of fantasy and we get sucked into these long series, even smaller series like, trilogies and stuff like that. It can be hard to find a nice standalone fantasy book to fit into those gaps, or even something a little bit different, still fantastical, but something a little bit different to just, cleanse the palate and fit into some of these longer series that we have ongoing. So what I'm bringing you today is a top 10 list of those standalone, some of the best fantasy standalone novels that I continue to come across. And these are the ones that I'm going to go to when I'm about to choose my next fantasy standalone to fit into some of these series. Some of these books I own, some of them I don't. So for the sake of convenience, I'll probably just go ahead and throw up a cover just so you guys know what the hell I'm talking about. And you guys can go ahead and find these if you're looking for them. I'm sure you guys have heard of a bunch of these. Some of them might not have been on your radar for some time. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first book that is probably going to be one of my next fantasy standalones that I'm going to fit in is The Night Circus. Lots of my friends have read this and give it very high praise. It sounds like something that I would enjoy. I'll go ahead and read a little bit of a blurb, but it basically says, it tells the story of the rivalry between two forms of magic, the old and the new, and the competition and love affair between two young magicians who are destined to face each other in a magical duel to the death. And so that sounds pretty awesome. Again, I know a bunch of people who have read this. A couple people have read it very recently and recommended it to me. And so I think this is going to be the next fantasy standalone that I go ahead and fit in. It's not a huge book. I hear very good things. It gets pretty good ratings on Goodreads and stuff. So I own this one on digital, on ebook, and this is definitely one that I've had my eye on for quite some time. So again, this is probably going to be the next one that I try and fit in. The next one is one that I read a long time ago, before I knew about this author, before I really got deep into fantasy and started reading kind of as much as I do now. And that is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This book takes place in the Cosmere. I think this was his first real, published novel. And it follows some royal family politics in a world where all of a sudden magic fails or disappears or something like that. And these Elantrians, Elantris is the capital of this, city, and the Elantrians turn into it says these lepers or zombie-like, beings. And then of course the city itself starts to fall apart and stuff. So this is one where I've been sort of warned that, Brandon Sanderson has obviously really evolved tremendously as an author, and he's become, very, very well known and much more of an expert now than he was when this book came out. I think it was the early 2000s when this came out. But now, having read a lot more Brandon Sanderson and a lot more fantasy and having, a much more experience to draw from as a reader, I'd like to go back and visit this one. It's one that I have to admit I keep deferring just because I know that going back in an author's catalog might not always be the most satisfying way to do it. But this is one I want to revisit because I don't think I appreciated it when I read it. I didn't really, for some reason, it didn't continue my thirst for Brandon Sanderson's work. I didn't really think, I didn't really remember much of it, to be quite honest with you. So this is one that I've been looking at, maybe doing a reread. I wouldn't even call it a reread, just a read as a fresh, new fantasy reader. So yeah, Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. Speaking of Brandon Sanderson, another one that I own the physical of and that I've been very excited to read because it gets very good reviews. People seem to really like this one, and it functions so well as a nice fantasy standalone. It is a little bit bigger, and that is Warbreaker. The premise here is that there is, in this city, there's these two sisters that are princesses, and one has, I guess, been groomed to be, married off at some point to the God King. And for one reason or another, and to avoid spoilers and stuff, of course, I don't really know what the hell happens, but at the last minute, things change, and the other sister has to marry the God King. The country sounds like it's at the brink of war, and the only way to avoid that is by having this sister marry the God King, and of course, it doesn't go down that way. And so this one sounds really interesting. It's not a premise that would normally grab me, but people have really enjoyed this book. Some people that I know that have read it highly recommend it. The only caveat with this one is if you're going to read Stormlight, go ahead and read this either on its own before Stormlight or after Way of Kings and then before Words of Radiance and Oathbringer, because apparently there's a character that comes up in those books. And I don't think it's a huge thing, but I think it's enough where you'd want to have read Warbreaker first, and it may actually add some context to a character in those books. So if you're going to read Stormlight, go ahead and read this maybe before those books, like I mentioned, or it can just be read on its own. I think I'm going to read this either before I do a Stormlight archive read next year, which I plan to read through all of them then. I own all of them, but I haven't read them yet. Or I might read it like a friend of mine recommended after Way of Kings. The next one is by an author that I read recently. I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and I've seen this Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell adaptation, first of all, around, and I know that that's also a book by Susanna Clarke, and I've had my eye on it here and there. It sounds like something that I could be interested in, but apparently it's quite a good standalone. I actually have a version of it that's split into 3 very small volumes, but for all intents and purposes, it's a standalone magical realism type of story. And I want to try Susanna Clarke one more time. I thought Piranesi was good. It didn't quite do for me what I thought it would. And it fell short in a few areas. So I kind of want to try Susanna Clarke one more time. I think this might be more up my alley than Piranesi was. And I'll go ahead and read a little bit of a blurb on it because I don't know much about it either, but it says, at the dawn of the 19th century, 2 very different magicians emerged to change England's history. In the year 1806, with the Napoleonic Wars raging on at land and sea, most people believe magic to be long dead in England, until the reclusive Mr. Norrell reveals his powers and becomes a celebrity overnight. Soon, another practicing magician comes forth, the young, handsome, and daring Jonathan Strange. He becomes Norrell's student, and they join forces in the war against France. Blah, 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 something, something, 18th century. Sounds pretty cool. Not sure how that's going to go, but again, I want to try Susanna Clarke one more time. The next one is by a Canadian author that I've been trying to read for a while, or I've wanted to read for a while, and I haven't got around to it. And I own the physical of this, and that is Tigana by Guy Gabriel Kay. This one seems to be, when people recommend Guy Gabriel Kay, even the people that, are pretty well read in Guy Gabriel Kay will say that this is probably one of his best books, and it's one that's recommended most often, at least to me. It says the novel set in a fictional world in a region called the Peninsula of the Palm, which is basically, Renaissance Italy and the Peloponnese and that kind of vibe. And it's the magical story of a beleaguered land struggling to be free. It's the tale of a people so cursed by the black sorcery of a cruel despotic king that even the name of their once beautiful homeland cannot be spoken or remembered. And that is, of course, Tigana. So yeah, that one is one that I really want to try. I have it on my shelf. I think that's going to be my first Guy Gabriel Kay book. He's Canadian. I'm Canadian, so I hope I like him. I know Jake Bishop really likes Guy Gabriel Kay. He has some excellent videos that I'm trying to go through and see where I might land with him. But I think this is going to be one that I'll fit in when I'm able to, and this will be my first Guy Gabriel Kay book for sure. The next one is one that I heard a lot of buzz about over the last, couple years. And I have to admit, it was an absolute cover buy. It was a book that I saw on the shelf at the bookstore, and I was like, this is probably one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen. And that is The Priory of the Orange Tree. This is an Asian-inspired fantasy novel with, basically about a city or a world that's besieged by these dragons and under threat of a reawakening of this great evil dragon that is supposed to, cause ruin and all that kind of stuff. And so it's about this world trying to deal with that. It's, as I said, very Asian inspired, a lot of strong female leads. There's a lot of themes in this one that I've heard discussed, and it's just a beautiful cover. And it is a big book, so it's put me off it a little bit because it's not one that you can just slide in to your schedule, but it's one that is very intriguing. I know some people that have really enjoyed it, and so I hope to as well. It's just not one that I can slide into my schedule as easily, but it's definitely a priority and one that should be on the list of contenders for, the next fantasy standalone to try. The next one is one that I also own the physical of, and it was brought to my attention by Patrick Leo, who really gave this thing high praise and touted it as an excellent Asian-inspired self-published debut. and that is The Sword of Kaigen. This one is an Eastern Asian inspired story about politics, propaganda, and survival. It says we follow the story of Misaka and her 14-year-old son Mamora. Misaka is a mother married to Tekeru, a master of the Whispering Blade. She left her adventurous life to settle down and raise a family. And apparently there are a lot of themes of, motherhood and family and politics and things like that. And it's supposed to be very interesting. I've heard that it's expertly written. I've heard a couple comments about maybe the pacing and the middle section of that book, but overall people have been incredibly impressed with this one. And when I'm in the mood for that sort of Asian inspired standalone fantasy, this is probably one that I'll gravitate to first. But yeah, I've heard great things. This has been on my list for a while and definitely one that's worth checking out. The next one is one by an author that I haven't read a whole lot from. The books that I have read, I've quite enjoyed, but I've also heard some divisive opinions about this one. And this one is a shorter book, very short. It's very low commitment, and it is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. I know that some people really like this one. I know that some people are a little bit let down by this one. Some prolific, Neil Gaiman readers tend to think that this is probably their least favorite. I kind of want to try this one because it's a lower commitment, smaller volume by this author that I can just slide in whenever I have a chance. And it's basically a sort of fairy tale portal fantasy about, in the 18th century, there's this boy who is basically trying to win this lady's hand by promising to retrieve a fallen star. This one definitely has, fairy tale vibes and some romance and stuff, which is, again, not something I typically gravitate to, but I want to read more Neil Gaiman. This is one that is, like I said, slow, low commitment, smaller to fit in. And so I think the next Neil Gaiman, if I'm looking for, something quick and easy to fit into my schedule and I'm looking for a Neil Gaiman book, this is probably the one that I'll choose. The next one on the list I've heard a lot of good things about, and it's another one that I wouldn't necessarily pick up on my own, but it's been recommended many times. It's one that I sort of thought was a children's book or maybe read a little bit more middle grade, but it's one that's definitely enjoyed by adults all the same, and that is The Last Unicorn. This is basically about the last unicorn realizing or finding out that they may in fact be the last of their kind, and then going on this quest to find out what happened to the others. From what I hear, it's actually a very nice kind of charming story. There's something special to it. And so, I don't know, it's another book that's not huge. And if I'm looking for a fantasy standalone to fit in, something that is a little bit more fairy tale-esque and charming and stuff like that, this is another one that I would probably slide in. The last one is a little bit more up my alley, and it's one that a friend of mine just finished and could not stop gushing about, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This one you've probably seen all over BookTube, and it says it follows the story of a young French woman in 1714. She basically sells her soul and makes a bargain with the devil that she is to be immortal, but as a result, everybody that she meets will not remember her. That's kind of a cool premise. I wondered kind of how that would go, and apparently it's done really well. And so yeah, that's one that I've been eyeing for a while. There's a really nice special edition that I keep passing on in the bookstore, and I always think, man, I should just pick that up because it's a nice looking cover and I know I'm going to read it. And then I had my friend Steph who just finished it and adored it. And so that makes me want to prioritize it, bump it up my list a little bit. So that's another fantasy standalone that should be on your list of, good standalone fantasy novels to fit into your busy schedule when you're in the middle of all these long series and you're looking for something lower commitment, maybe smaller, maybe something that cleanses the palate, that's still fantasy, but not maybe epic fantasy or, not the typical stuff you would read. So this list, I hope, was a bunch of different types of fantasy standalones, some of the best that I continue to come across in my search for fantasy standalones to fit in. Some are a little bit lighter and more maybe fairy tale. Some are a little bit darker. Some are more serious and adult. Some are more magical realism. Some are epic fantasy. So hopefully you found something on this list that might pique your interest. I know that whenever I try and fit something in, I'll probably be going to this list because these are supposed to be really good ones. So that's it for me, guys. I am currently working on a couple book reviews to bring you guys, but I thought I'd quickly throw this list out there and see if it helps anybody in their search as well. So that's it for me. I will catch you guys on the next one.